Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, I need to tell you about a death that changed everything. April 1502. A 15-year-old prince is dying in a castle in Wales. He's sweating so violently that his sheets are soaked through every hour. His skin is burning, his heart is racing, and within 6 hours of the first symptoms, he'll be dead. His name is Arthur Tudor, and he's supposed to be the next King of England. But he won't be. Because in 6 hours his younger brother Henry, a spoiled, loud second son who was never meant to rule, will become heir to the throne instead. And because of that one fever, because Arthur's body couldn't fight off sweating sickness, 6 women will lose their heads. England will tear itself apart, the Catholic Church will fracture, and the entire shape of the modern world will be rewritten in blood. But what if Arthur's heart had kept beating? What if he'd survived that April night? What if Henry VIII, the monster who haunts history, had never become king at all? Before we dive in, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy these deep dives into the darkest corners of history. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it where you are? I love seeing who's joining us from around the world, whether you're winding down for bed or just starting your day. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and let's ease into this journey together. Because what we're about to uncover will make you question everything you thought you knew about fate, power, and the fragility of history itself. In 1502, Arthur Tudor was dying, and he knew it. Sweating sickness didn't give you time to pretend otherwise. It started with a headache, then violent chills that made your teeth chatter so hard they could crack. Within an hour, the sweating began. Not normal sweat, this was something else entirely. Victims described it as water pouring from every pore, soaking through multiple layers of clothing, pooling on the floor beneath their beds. The stench was unbearable, a sour, almost sweet smell that servants recognized immediately. Once you smelled it, you knew, because sweating sickness killed fast, sometimes in 3 hours, sometimes in 6, rarely longer than a day. Your heart would race so fast you could see your chest vibrating. Your head would pound like something was trying to crack out of your skull. And then suddenly, your heart would just stop. Arthur felt all of this. He was 15 years old, lying in Ludlow Castle, recently married to Catherine of Aragon, and by all accounts, he was everything a future king should be. His tutors didn't just praise his Latin. They said he wrote poetry in it, composed letters to Erasmus discussing philosophy, and could recite Virgil from memory. He played the lute. He understood mathematics. He had been raised from birth to be a king, every moment of his education carefully orchestrated by his father, Henry VII. But here's something most people don't know. Arthur was already sick before sweating sickness took him. Contemporary accounts from his household mention that he had a weak chest and frequently suffered from respiratory infections. Some modern historians believe he had tuberculosis, the White Death that would later kill millions. His wedding night with Catherine was reportedly a disaster, not because of any scandal, but because Arthur was too weak to consummate the marriage. He may have coughed blood into his hand that night, something Catherine would later deny under oath, but her Spanish ladies-in-waiting whispered about for years. So when sweating sickness hit him, that April, his body had nothing left to fight with. His lungs were already compromised. His immune system was already struggling. He was, in medical terms, doomed. But let's imagine a different scenario. Let's imagine that Arthur's tuberculosis was caught earlier, that his physicians, primitive as they were, had prescribed the one thing that might have helped: rest, fresh air, and removal from the damp Welsh climate. Let's imagine he'd been sent to a drier part of England, somewhere with better ventilation than the stone tomb of Ludlow Castle. If Arthur had survived 1502, everything changes, not just politically, but medically, culturally, religiously. Because Arthur wasn't Henry, and that difference ran deeper than anyone realised. Here's another obscure detail that changes everything. Arthur had been trained in the mirror of princes tradition. a medieval educational philosophy that taught future kings to see themselves as servants of their people, not masters. His primary textbook was The Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, which emphasized restraint, learning, and diplomatic grace over martial prowess. Henry, by contrast, was given Le Morte d'Arthur and stories of warrior kings. He was taught to joust, to hunt, to see kingship as glorious combat. Arthur learned to negotiate. Henry learned to conquer. Arthur studied law. Henry studied warfare. Arthur was being groomed to manage an empire. Henry was being groomed to support his brother, to be a duke, maybe a military commander, but never to rule. So when Arthur's fever broke him, when his heart gave its final struggling beat and Catherine sat beside his corpse in that cold Welsh castle, history pivoted. The careful, diplomatic future that had been planned for England died with him. And waiting in the wings was a boy who had been raised for glory, not governance. Henry was 10 years old when Arthur died. He didn't immediately become heir. There was a period of uncertainty while Henry VII considered other options. But eventually, inevitably, Henry was named Prince of Wales. And from that moment, the quiet, studious education stopped. Now, Henry needed to be a king. But he'd missed the crucial years of training. He'd missed the lessons in restraint, in diplomacy, in seeing the crown as a burden rather than a prize. Instead, Henry learned to be spectacular. He grew tall, over 6 feet, massive for the era. He became an exceptional athlete, able to draw a bow that required 150 pounds of force, something most men couldn't even string. He could joust for hours, his armour weighing 60 pounds, and still dance through the night. He wrote music, not just simple tunes, but complex polyphonic compositions. He was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly convinced of his own magnificence. Arthur would have been respected. Henry demanded to be adored. And that difference, that fundamental difference in how they saw themselves, would determine the fate of millions. But here's what haunts me most. In Arthur's household records, there's a note from March 1502, 1 month before his death. His treasurer recorded an expense for medicines and treatments for the prince's cough and for perfumed herbs to cleanse his chamber air. They knew he was sick. They were trying to save him. And they failed by 1 month. If those treatments had worked just a little better, if Arthur's lungs had been just slightly stronger, if the sweating sickness had arrived just a few weeks later, when he'd recovered from his respiratory infection, he might have survived. History turned on lungs full of fluid and a fever that wouldn't break. And because of that, because Arthur couldn't draw one more breath, 6 women would eventually die. Thousands would burn at the stake, and England would never be the same. Arthur becomes king in 1509, just as Henry did in our timeline. He's 22 years old, recently married to Catherine, and immediately the tone of the reign is different. Where Henry's coronation was a 5-day festival of excess, 500 oxen slaughtered, wine flowing from public fountains, jousting tournaments, where men died for entertainment, Arthur's coronation would have been dignified, solemn, expensive, but not wasteful. And here's a crucial detail most people miss. Arthur's coronation wouldn't have included the traditional coronation feast, where the king ate swan. Arthur was known to be squeamish about blood sports. His household accounts show he rarely hunted, and when he did, he refused to participate in the breaking of the deer. The ritual where the animal's still warm entrails were spread on the ground, and hounds were allowed to feed while nobles watched. Henry loved that ritual. He would later make it even more elaborate, sometimes wading into the pile of steaming organs himself to show his mastery over nature. Arthur found it barbaric. In a letter to Erasmus preserved in Cambridge, Arthur wrote that he believed the measure of a prince is not in what he can destroy, but what he can preserve. This wasn't just philosophical, it was practical. Arthur understood that his father, Henry VII had left the treasury full specifically because he'd avoided expensive wars and wasteful displays. One of Henry VIII's first acts as king was to execute his father's most hated ministers, Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson. But here's what's rarely mentioned. Henry had them tortured first. Not for information, they'd already confessed to everything and nothing, but because Henry wanted his first act as king to be memorable. Dudley's fingernails were pulled out one by one in the Tower of London. Empson was placed in the scavenger's daughter, a device that compressed the body until blood leaked from the nose and ears. Both men were kept alive for weeks, displayed to courtiers as a warning, before finally being beheaded on Tower Hill. Arthur wouldn't have done that, not because he was soft, but because he understood that stability required continuity. He would have kept his father's advisors, at least initially, and governed with the same careful paranoia that had kept Henry VII in power for 24 years. Henry VIII wanted to be a warrior. In 1513, he invaded France with an army of 30,000 men. The campaign was called the Battle of the Spurs because the French cavalry ran away so fast all the English captured were their spurs. It cost £960,000, roughly 4 years of royal revenue, and achieved nothing except the capture of 2 small towns that England couldn't afford to garrison and had to give back 2 years later. During that campaign, English soldiers died not from combat but from dysentery, so severe that contemporary accounts describe men shitting themselves to death in their tents, their bowels literally falling out from the strain. The smell of the camp could be detected from 3 miles away. Arthur wouldn't have done that. He would have pursued diplomacy, not conquest. He would have maintained the alliance with Spain, strengthened ties with the Holy Roman Empire, and avoided costly wars. His foreign policy would have been based on the principle that his father had taught him: the best wars are the ones never fought, for they preserve both gold and blood. This is the England that never was, a quiet England, a stable England, an England that didn't bankrupt itself chasing glory or stacking bodies in French fields. But here's the thing about quiet stability. It doesn't make for legendary kings. Arthur would have been respected, but not feared, admired, but not remembered. History loves spectacle, and Arthur simply wasn't built for it. He was too busy reading in the library while Henry was outside challenging anyone to a wrestling match. He was too busy memorizing trade agreements while Henry was commissioning another suit of armour covered in gold leaf. Still, his reign would have had profound effects. Without the break from Rome, England remains Catholic. The Pope's authority over the English Church remains intact. The monasteries, thousands of them controlling vast wealth and land, remain untouched. And this changes everything. Because in our timeline, those monasteries were England's social safety net. They fed the poor with leftovers from their kitchens, not generously, but enough to keep people alive. They ran hospitals where any beggar could receive basic treatment. The hospitals were really just long halls lined with straw mattresses where the sick could die with a roof over their heads. But that was more than most had. They taught children to read, at least enough to recite prayers, and they provided what passed for charity in the 16th century. When Henry dissolved the monasteries in the 1530s, all of that vanished. And here's the visceral reality. Within 5 years of the dissolution, beggars filled London streets in such numbers that you literally couldn't walk through certain neighbourhoods without stepping on sleeping bodies. The smell of unwashed humans, of infected wounds, of starvation. Contemporary writers described it as breathing corruption. Plague spread faster because the sick had nowhere to go. Crime exploded because the desperate have nothing to lose. Under Arthur, none of that happens. The monasteries remain. The monks might be corrupt, hypocritical, and wealthy, but the soup kitchens stay open. The hospitals keep their doors unlocked, and England's poor, while still suffering, aren't quite so desperate. But there's a cost to this stability. Without the windfall of monastery lands, Arthur would have faced constant financial pressure. His father had hoarded wealth, but maintaining a kingdom required constant spending. Roads needed repair, armies needed paying, even in peacetime. The navy needed building, especially as Spain and Portugal divided the world between them. Arthur would have been forced to call Parliament more often, to negotiate for funds, to make concessions to nobles and merchants in exchange for taxes. And here's an obscure but crucial detail. In the 1510s, a new class of gentry was emerging, wealthy landowners who weren't quite nobles but had money and education. They wanted a voice in government. Under Henry, they were mostly ignored or intimidated. Under Arthur, they might have gained real power. In doing so, Arthur might have accidentally strengthened parliamentary power decades earlier than it actually developed. He might have created a more constitutional monarchy simply by being too financially constrained to be tyrannical. There's a document in the National Archives, a petition from 1514 to Henry VIII, where Parliament asked for regular sessions and advisory powers. Henry ignored it. Arthur might not have been able to, but let's not get too rosy about this alternate England, because even without Henry's chaos, the 16th century was brutal. The sweating sickness that killed Arthur in our timeline didn't disappear. It came back in waves: 1508, 1517, 1528, 1551. Each time, it killed thousands in a matter of weeks. The 1528 outbreak was so severe that people dropped dead in the streets mid-conversation, sweat pouring off them, their clothes soaked through in minutes. Anne Boleyn caught it that year and survived, one of the few who did. Most victims were dead within hours, their bodies turning cold even as sweat still dripped from their skin. If Arthur survived 1502, he might not have survived the next outbreak, and if he died young, without a clear heir, England would have faced a crisis anyway. So let's pause here and ask ourselves, and I want you to really think about this as you're listening, maybe turning this over in your mind as you drift towards sleep. Would you have chosen Arthur's quiet stability over Henry's spectacular chaos, knowing that one led to less immediate suffering but potentially less progress, while the other led to violence but also transformation? Which kind of king would you want in a world that's fundamentally broken? Think about that. We'll come back to it. Let's say Arthur lives. Let's say he rules for 30 years, maybe more. England remains Catholic, the monasteries stand, and the Pope's authority is never challenged. On the surface, this sounds peaceful, stable, but dig deeper and you realise this alternate England is sitting on a powder keg, soaked in holy water and human fear. Because the Protestant Reformation wasn't just about Henry VIII's divorce. It was already happening, spreading like infection through the body of Catholic Europe. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. But here's what most people don't know. He didn't just nail them up and walk away. He used his own blood to write on the door first. God sees all sins before hammering in the document. The blood stained the wood, and locals saw it as either divine message or demonic sign, depending on where they stood. Luther's ideas that salvation came through faith alone, that the Bible should be translated into common languages, that the Pope was corrupt, spread like wildfire across Europe. But they didn't just spread through books, they spread through songs. Luther wrote hymns that people sang in taverns, bawdy drinking songs with theological messages hidden in the verses. People who couldn't read could sing, "A mighty fortress is our God," and absorb Protestant doctrine through melody. The Catholic Church tried to ban the songs, but you can't unhear a tune. Germany fractured, Switzerland fractured, Scandinavia converted, France teetered on the edge of civil war. And here's a detail that changes everything. In 1545, the Council of Trent convened to reform the Catholic Church from within, to address the corruption that was driving people toward Protestantism. But it came too late, and its reforms were half-hearted. If Arthur had ruled, If England had remained Catholic but pushed for reform, he might have accelerated that council by a decade. He had connections. His wife Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who called the council. Arthur might have pressured Rome to reform earlier, to address clerical corruption, to allow vernacular scripture in controlled circumstances. But Rome wouldn't have liked that. The Pope would have seen any reform as weakness, any concession as the beginning of collapse. And here's where it gets visceral. The Inquisition was the Church's answer to reform-minded Catholics who pushed too hard. Spain's Inquisition, which Catherine grew up witnessing, burned an average of 2 people per month throughout the 1500s. Not just heretics, reform-minded priests, scholars who translated Bible verses, anyone who questioned too loudly. The burnings weren't quick. Victims were tied to stakes with green wood that smoked rather than burned cleanly. The idea was to suffocate them with smoke before the flames reached them, which was considered merciful. But green wood burned slowly, unpredictably. Sometimes victims roasted for 20 minutes, their skin blistering and splitting, fat dripping off their bodies like candle wax before they finally died. The smell, burning pork mixed with burning hair and the distinctive sweet sick stench of roasting human fat, lingered over towns for days after an auto-da-fe. Children were brought to watch, to learn what happened to heretics. Arthur, for all his learning and diplomacy, would have had to make a choice: support these methods to maintain Catholic orthodoxy, or allow limited reform and risk Rome's wrath. And here's an obscure but crucial detail. In 1518, a group of English scholars at Oxford began meeting secretly to discuss Luther's writings. They called themselves the White Horse Circle because they met at the White Horse Tavern. Among them was Thomas Cranmer, who would later become Archbishop of Canterbury under Henry and author the English Book of Common Prayer. Under Henry, Cranmer survived. Under Arthur, he might have been arrested, tortured, and burned. Because Arthur wouldn't have broken with Rome, but he also couldn't have stopped Protestant ideas from seeping in. Merchants brought pamphlets, students brought books, sailors brought rumours, and once people started reading the Bible in English, even illegally copied pages bound in leather and hidden under floorboards, there was no going back. William Tyndale's English Bible was published in 1526. Henry tried to suppress it by buying up copies and burning them publicly. But here's what's rarely mentioned. Those public burnings became spectacles that attracted crowds, and in those crowds people saw what was being burned and became curious. It was free advertising. More people wanted to read the forbidden Bible because it was forbidden. Under Arthur, Tyndale's Bible would still have appeared. Arthur would have faced the same pressure to suppress it. And if he did, he would have had to burn not just books, but people. Because by the 1530s, Protestant believers in England weren't just reading, they were preaching, building underground churches and converting their neighbours. Arthur would have faced a choice: brutal suppression or gradual tolerance. If he chose suppression, England would have seen its own Spanish Inquisition, not as systematic perhaps, but just as cruel. Burnings at Smithfield, torture in the Tower, families torn apart as children, informed on parents for heresy. If he chose tolerance, he would have angered Rome, alienated conservative nobles, and potentially faced a Catholic rebellion from within his own kingdom. There was no good choice, just different kinds of blood. And here's the heartbreaking irony. Henry's Reformation, brutal as it was, ripped the band-aid off quickly. He broke with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and forced the kingdom to choose a side. It was violent, yes, but it was decisive. Arthur wouldn't have done that. He would have tried to compromise, to negotiate, to hold the centre. And maybe, just maybe, that would have been worse, because the religious wars of the 16th century, the French Wars of Religion, the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands, the 30 Years' War in Germany. All of them were prolonged, brutal conflicts where neither side could win decisively. England, trying to stay neutral, trying to be Catholic but reform-minded, might have been torn apart slowly rather than all at once. Arthur might have presided over a low-grade civil war that lasted decades, where families feuded over theology, where villages burned each other's churches, where no one was safe because no one knew who believed what. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Even under Arthur, even with the best intentions, England might have ended up in the same place, torn between Catholic and Protestant factions, bleeding in the streets, families divided by faith. The difference is timing, and timing in history is everything. In our timeline, Henry's break with Rome happened in the 1530s during his lifetime. The violence was concentrated, controlled by a single, strong king. By the time his children inherited the throne, the break was already complete. But if Arthur had ruled, the break might have come later, maybe in the 1550s, maybe in the 1560s, after his death. And by then, the stakes would have been even higher, because by the 1560s, Europe was in the throes of religious wars. France was being torn apart by conflicts between Catholics and Huguenots, the St. Bartholomew's Day. Massacre in 1572 saw 30,000 Protestants murdered in a single month, their bodies thrown into the Seine until the river ran red and fish wouldn't bite because they'd gorged on human flesh. If England had remained Catholic under Arthur and then suddenly fractured after his death, it might have been pulled into these conflicts. Spain might have intervened to protect Catholicism, sending armies to liberate England from Protestant heresy. Scotland might have pushed its own claim to the throne, using religious justification, and England, instead of weathering the storm, might have drowned in it. Let's talk about the women, because in our timeline, Henry VIII is infamous for his 6 wives, his obsession with producing a male heir, and the trail of broken women he left behind. But if Arthur had lived, none of that would have happened. Catherine of Aragon would have been the only queen. There would have been no Anne Boleyn, no Jane Seymour, no Anne of Cleves, no Catherine Howard, no Catherine Parr. And honestly, that might have been the single greatest mercy of this alternate timeline. Catherine of Aragon was 15 years old when she married Arthur. She was a Spanish princess, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, raised in the Alhambra Palace surrounded by luxury and learning. She spoke Latin, French and English by the time she was 12. She could debate theology with bishops. She had read Thomas Aquinas and Augustine. She was educated, devout, and raised to be a queen. But here's what no one tells you about her wedding night. She was terrified. Not of Arthur. By all accounts, he was gentle, probably too weak to be anything else, but of the ceremony itself. Medieval wedding nights weren't private affairs. The bride and groom were blessed by a bishop, then ceremonially put to bed while witnesses watched. The sheets were checked afterward for blood as proof of consummation and virginity. Catherine's Spanish ladies-in-waiting later testified that the sheets showed no blood, which either meant Arthur was too ill to consummate the marriage, or that Catherine's hymen had already broken naturally, something that happens to many women from horseback riding or other physical activity, but which 16th century society saw as proof of lost virginity. Her marriage to Arthur was brief. They were married in November 1501. By April 1502 he was dead, and Catherine's life, which should have been one of power and security, became a nightmare. Henry VII, Arthur's father, didn't want to lose the alliance with Spain, so he kept Catherine in England, half prisoner, half pawn, while he negotiated with her parents. For 6 years, Catherine lived in poverty. Her servants went unpaid. She had to pawn her jewellery, a golden cross set with rubies that had belonged to Isabella, her mother, to buy food. She wrote desperate letters to her father, begging for money, for support, for permission to come home. He ignored most of them. She was more valuable to him in England maintaining the alliance, than she would have been back in Spain. During those years, Catherine lived in a draughty house in London called Durham House. The roof leaked, rats nested in the walls. She could hear them at night, scratching inside the plaster, sometimes falling through gaps in the ceiling into her chambers. One of her ladies-in-waiting died from a rat bite that became infected. The wound on her hand swelled, turned black, and began to smell of rotting meat. She died screaming, her arm bloated to twice its normal size, black lines running up to her shoulder, where blood poisoning spread through her veins. When Henry VIII finally married Catherine in 1509, it seemed like a happy ending, but we all know how that story ends. Catherine gave Henry one surviving child, Mary, and when she couldn't give him a son, Henry discarded her. But here's the visceral reality of what Catherine endured. Between 1510 and 1518, she was pregnant at least 6 times, possibly 7. She had 3 stillborn sons, 2 miscarriages so early that historians debate whether they were pregnancies or just irregular bleeding, and 2 children who were born alive but died within weeks. Only Mary survived. Each stillbirth was traumatic. Medieval medicine had no understanding of sterile procedures. When Catherine went into labour with dead babies, midwives had to reach inside her with unwashed hands to pull out pieces of fetal tissue. The pain was excruciating. Women in labour were given nothing stronger than wine or ale, maybe a leather strap to bite down on. Catherine's screams could be heard throughout Hampton Court Palace during her labours. Servants reported that dogs would howl in response to her screaming, as if they sensed death in the air. After each loss, Catherine was expected to recover quickly and try again. There was no grief counselling, no time to mourn. She would spend weeks bleeding, weak from blood loss, while Henry visited her chambers to coldly assess when she'd be ready to conceive again. By her mid-30s, Catherine's body was destroyed. Her womb was scarred from repeated trauma. She suffered from what was probably endometriosis or adenomyosis, conditions that cause the lining of the uterus to grow into the muscle wall, creating excruciating pain during menstruation and intercourse. Every month, she bled so heavily that she was bedridden. Her ladies-in-waiting had to burn her sheets rather than wash them because the blood wouldn't come out. And when Henry finally decided to annul their marriage, he didn't just cast her aside, he humiliated her. He declared that their marriage had been invalid from the start because she'd been married to his brother. He forced her to testify about whether Arthur had consummated their marriage, making her discuss her wedding night in public court. He separated her from their daughter Mary, forbidding them from seeing each other. He stripped her of her title, calling her Princess Dowager instead of Queen. He moved her to increasingly remote and uncomfortable houses, each one draftier and more isolated than the last. Catherine spent her final years in Kimbolton Castle, a cold stone fortress in Cambridgeshire. She was allowed only a handful of servants. She wasn't given enough firewood to heat more than one room. She spent winters huddled by a small fire, wearing multiple layers of clothing because she couldn't afford to keep warm otherwise. Her hands developed chilblains, painful swellings caused by cold that made her fingers crack and bleed. She died in January 1536, at age 50, alone except for a few loyal servants. Her last letter to Henry begged him to care for Mary and signed Catherine the Queen. He never replied. At her autopsy, the physician noted that her heart was discoloured, with a black growth attached to it. Modern doctors think it was probably a tumour, possibly metastatic cancer that had spread from elsewhere in her body. She died in pain, cold and abandoned, but if Arthur had lived, Catherine's story would have been completely different. She would have been Queen of England for decades. She would have had power, status, security. Even if she couldn't produce a surviving male heir, Arthur wouldn't have humiliated her. He wouldn't have paraded mistresses in front of her. In fact, there's no evidence Arthur ever took a mistress. His household accounts show no unexplained gifts to women, no secret apartments maintained at court, none of the telltale signs of royal infidelity. Arthur had been raised to value duty over desire. If Catherine couldn't give him sons, he might have quietly remarried after her death, by natural causes, in her 50s, surrounded by grandchildren, even if they weren't male heirs. Or he might have accepted a daughter as his successor, as Spain had done with Isabella. Catherine would have been allowed to age with dignity. She would have been buried as a queen, mourned by her people, remembered with honour. Her tomb would have been in Westminster Abbey, not Peterborough Cathedral, where she was buried as Princess Dowager, in a ceremony so cheap that Henry refused to pay for proper mourning clothes for her servants. And the other women, the ones who became Henry's wives, would have lived completely different lives. Anne Boleyn would never have caught the king's eye. In our timeline, Anne was witty, educated, and ambitious. She'd been educated in France, spoke French fluently, and brought continental sophistication to the English court. But she was also calculating. She understood that sex before marriage meant becoming a discarded mistress. So she held out, promising Henry everything once he married her. That game took 7 years and destroyed England's relationship with Rome. But if Arthur had ruled, Anne would have been just another lady-in-waiting. She might have married some minor noble, borne him 4 or 5 children, and died in obscurity at 40 from complications of childbirth, the leading cause of death for women in the 16th century. She wouldn't have been crowned queen in Westminster Abbey, wearing purple velvet and ermine, her belly already swelling with Elizabeth. She wouldn't have revolutionised English fashion, bringing French hoods and elegant gowns to court. She wouldn't have commissioned the most beautiful buildings of the Tudor era. And she wouldn't have been beheaded on false charges of adultery and treason, her head severed by a French swordsman on Tower Green while she knelt blindfolded, praying in French. Here's the visceral reality of Anne's execution. Henry imported a specialist executioner from Calais because English headsmen used axes, which required multiple blows and often resulted in botched executions. The French swordsman used a greatsword, swung horizontally while the victim knelt upright. It was supposed to be quick, merciful, one clean blow. Anne prepared carefully. She wore a grey damask gown with a low neckline to expose her neck fully. She arranged her hair in a coif so it wouldn't obstruct the blade. She practiced the kneeling position the night before, making sure she could hold it steadily without flinching. She was terrified that any movement might cause the executioner to miss, might mean a second blow or a botched death. On the scaffold, she gave a brief speech praising Henry, as was required. Then she knelt, tucked her skirts around her legs for modesty, and said, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul." The executioner had hidden the sword in straw so she wouldn't see it coming and flinch. While she prayed, he picked it up silently, stepped forward, and swung. One witness said her lips were still moving in prayer after her head hit the straw. Another said her eyes blinked twice after the sword passed through her neck, as if her brain was still processing what had happened. If Arthur had lived, Anne Boleyn would never have knelt on that scaffold. She would never have felt that brief, terrible moment of the blade passing through her neck. She would have died quietly, privately, unmemorable, and maybe that would have been better. Jane Seymour wouldn't have been pulled into court intrigue. In our timeline, Jane was the daughter of a minor noble family, plain-faced and quiet. She was chosen specifically because she was the opposite of Anne, meek where Anne was bold, pale and blonde, where Anne was dark and exotic. Henry married her 11 days after Anne's execution, while Anne's blood was still being scrubbed from the Tower Green stones. Jane gave Henry what he wanted, a son. Edward was born in October 1537, after a labour that lasted 3 days. Jane screamed so hard and so long that her voice gave out. By the second day, she was begging the midwives to cut the baby out. to kill her if necessary, but save the child. Medieval caesarean sections were death sentences. The mother always died from blood loss or infection. The midwives refused. On the third day, Edward was finally born, but he was stuck. His shoulders were too wide. The midwives had to break one of his collarbones to get him out, feeling the tiny bones snap under their fingers. Jane hemorrhaged immediately after birth, blood pouring out in gushing waves that soaked through the sheets and pooled on the floor. She developed childbed fever within days, puerperal sepsis caused by bacteria entering the uterus during labour. Her wound became infected. She burned with fever. Her abdomen swelled and hardened. The infection spread to her bloodstream. She died 12 days after giving birth, her body already starting to decompose from the inside, the smell of rotting tissue filling her chamber even before she stopped breathing. If Arthur had lived, Jane Seymour might have married young, born children, and died in her 40s, still possibly from childbirth complications, because that was the reality for all women, but not as a queen, not as a political sacrifice, not as a woman whose only value was her ability to produce a male heir. I need to pause here and ask you something. Really think about this as you're listening, as you're imagining these women's lives. If you could go back and warn just one of Henry's wives about her fate, which one would you choose? And more importantly, do you think she would have believed you? Or would she have thought the crown was worth the risk? Consider that. Let it sit with you. Anne of Cleves wouldn't have been imported from Germany for a political marriage, only to be rejected because Henry found her unattractive. The portrait he'd commissioned, painted by Hans Holbein, showed a serene, pleasant-looking woman. When Anne arrived in England, Henry was so excited he rode ahead of the formal welcome party, disguised as a messenger, bursting into her chambers to surprise her romantically, like something from a medieval romance. But Anne didn't recognise him. She saw a fat, ageing man with an ulcerated leg that stank of rotting flesh. Henry's jousting injury from 1536 had never healed, and by 1540 the wound required daily draining of pus. She recoiled. She didn't swoon or blush or play along with his fantasy. She looked confused and slightly disgusted. Henry was humiliated. His ego couldn't handle the fact that this German princess didn't find him desirable. So he decided she was ugly, called her the Flanders mare behind her back. Though he never said it to her face, he refused to consummate the marriage. On their wedding night, he climbed into bed with her, lay there for a few minutes, then got up and left, telling his servants that her body was disordered and indisposed, and that her breasts were so slack and flabby that he couldn't perform. Anne, who spoke no English and had no idea what was happening, was divorced after 6 months and forced to agree that the marriage had never been consummated. She had to sign documents admitting that Henry had never touched her, publicly humiliating herself to save her life. But here's what's rarely mentioned. Anne was terrified that Henry would execute her, like he'd executed Anne Boleyn. She'd heard the stories. She knew what happened to wives who displeased the king. So when Henry's ministers came to her with the divorce papers, she signed immediately, agreed to everything, and thanked them for Henry's mercy. In exchange, she received a generous settlement, several manor houses, enough income to live comfortably, and the honorary title of the king's sister. She lived quietly in England for the rest of her life, outliving Henry by 10 years. But she lived in constant low-grade terror, never sure if Henry might change his mind and decide she was a threat. She never remarried, whether by choice or because Henry forbade it, we don't know. If Arthur had lived, Anne of Cleves would have stayed in Germany. She might have married a local duke, might have lived her entire life speaking her own language, surrounded by family. She wouldn't have been humiliated. She wouldn't have had to lie about her own body to save her life. She wouldn't have spent 10 years looking over her shoulder, wondering if the king who'd rejected her might someday decide she knew too much. Catherine Howard wouldn't have been used as a pawn by her ambitious family, married off to a king old enough to be her grandfather, and then executed at 19 years old for alleged infidelity. Catherine was probably born around 1523, which means she was about 17 when Henry married her in 1540. His fifth wife, his rose without a thorn. Henry was 49, grotesquely obese, unable to walk without assistance because of his infected leg. He could barely climb stairs. His waist measured 54 inches. His armour, preserved in the Tower of London, tells the story of his physical decline. The elegant suits from his 20s versus the massive barrel-shaped torso of his final years. Catherine was a child. She'd been raised in a household with minimal supervision, where she'd had adolescent flirtations with music teachers and young men. This wasn't scandalous for a teenage girl in the 1530s. It was normal. But when those flirtations came to light after her marriage, they were reframed as evidence of lifelong promiscuity. Henry was devastated, not because he loved Catherine, he barely knew her, but because his ego couldn't handle the idea that a teenage girl might not be satisfied with an obese, impotent old man with a suppurating wound. He had her arrested, imprisoned in her chambers, while investigators interviewed everyone she'd ever known. The evidence against her was thin. She'd probably had a pre-marital flirtation with a young man named Francis Derham. There was some suggestion that she'd continued a flirtation with Thomas Culpeper, one of Henry's courtiers, after her marriage. They'd met alone several times, which was technically treason because the king's wife's body belonged to the king. But there was no evidence of actual adultery, just a teenager who'd been foolish enough to meet privately with a young man who showed her attention. It didn't matter. Henry needed her to be guilty because the alternative, that she'd simply been indiscreet, that she'd been a confused teenager trapped in a political marriage, would make him look foolish. So she was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. Here's the part that haunts me. Catherine was so young that she didn't fully understand what was happening until the very end. She was kept in Sion Abbey while awaiting execution, and according to witnesses, she asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head on it correctly. She was terrified of embarrassing herself on the scaffold, of not dying properly, of giving the crowd something to mock. On the morning of her execution, she was so weak from fear that she could barely walk to the scaffold and had to be supported by guards. She was 19 years old. She gave no speech. She couldn't speak without crying. She knelt at the block, positioned her neck, and the executioner brought down the axe. It took one blow, but it wasn't clean. The axe hit slightly off-centre, cutting through most of her neck, but leaving a flap of skin and muscle still attached. The executioner had to saw through the remaining tissue with his blade while Catherine's body convulsed. Blood sprayed across the scaffold in arterial spurts, pooling in the grooves between the wooden planks. If Arthur had lived, Catherine Howard would have been married to someone age-appropriate. She might have had a normal life. Marriages, children, the usual struggles of the 16th century. She wouldn't have been executed for the crime of being a confused teenager. Catherine Parr wouldn't have been dragged into a marriage she didn't want, forced to nurse an ageing, paranoid tyrant through his final years. In our timeline, Catherine was 31 years old when Henry married her in 1543, his sixth and final wife. She'd already been widowed twice. She was educated, intelligent, and had been planning to marry Thomas Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, when Henry decided he wanted her instead. You didn't say no to the king. Catherine broke off her engagement and married Henry, becoming stepmother to his 3 children and chief nurse to his rotting body. By 1543, Henry was a physical wreck. His leg wound was so infected that servants could smell him coming before they saw him. The wound had to be drained twice daily. Physicians would insert hollow reeds into the opening and squeeze out cups of yellow-green pus mixed with blood and bits of dead tissue. The smell was described as the stench of mortified flesh that clung to everything in Henry's chambers. The curtains, the bedding, even the walls seemed to absorb it. Catherine had to tend to him, to dress his wound, to breathe in that smell of death. She had to climb into bed beside a man whose body was literally decomposing while he was still alive. And she had to do it with a smile, with tenderness, because showing disgust could mean death. She also had to be careful about what she said. Henry's paranoia had grown with his physical decline. He saw traitors everywhere. In 1546, he nearly had Catherine arrested for heresy because she discussed religious reform with him a bit too enthusiastically. Only by throwing herself at his feet and claiming she'd only been trying to distract him from his pain did she save herself. She lived with that terror for 4 years, knowing that one wrong word, one theological debate that went too far, could end with her joining Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard on the scaffold. When Henry finally died in January 1547, Catherine was free. She was also traumatised. She'd spent 4 years in constant danger, nursing a dying tyrant, watching every word. Within months, she married Thomas Seymour, the man she'd wanted to marry in the first place. And within a year, she was dead from childbed fever at age 36. Finally pregnant after 3 marriages, only to die from the complications. If Arthur had lived, Catherine Parr might have married young, might have had a normal life. She wouldn't have spent her early 30s sleeping next to a man who smelled like a corpse and could have her killed with a word. For all her brilliance and power, Catherine Parr was still at the mercy of a system that treated women as property, as commodities, as disposable. Arthur might have been kinder, but he still would have been a man in a world that gave men absolute power and women none. And that's the real tragedy, not just what happened, but what keeps happening. Let's talk about Mary Tudor, Catherine of Aragon's only surviving child, born in 1516. In our timeline, Mary's life was a cascade of trauma that turned a bright, beloved child into a bitter, broken woman. Mary was adored as a little girl. Contemporary accounts describe her as precocious, musical, and charming. At age 6, she could play the virginals, a small harpsichord, well enough to perform for foreign ambassadors. At 9, she was betrothed to Francis I's son, the Dauphin of France, in a ceremony where she wore cloth of gold and a cap covered in jewels that was so heavy it gave her headaches. At 11, she was declared Princess of Wales and sent to Ludlow Castle, the same castle where Arthur had died, to learn how to govern. Everyone assumed Mary would marry well, probably to a European prince, and strengthen England's alliances. She was valuable, protected, and raised to understand her worth. Then everything collapsed. When Henry decided to annul his marriage to Catherine, Mary became collateral damage. Henry declared that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid, which meant Mary was illegitimate, a bastard with no claim to the throne. Overnight, she went from Princess of Wales to Lady Mary. Her household was disbanded, her jewels were confiscated, and she was sent to serve as a lady-in-waiting in her infant half-sister Elizabeth's household. Think about that. Mary, who'd been raised as heir to the throne, was now changing Elizabeth's diapers. But here's the visceral reality that's often glossed over. Mary wasn't just humiliated, she was psychologically tortured. Henry forbade her from seeing her mother. For years, Catherine was moved from castle to castle, increasingly isolated and ill, while Mary was kept at court under watch. They could exchange letters occasionally, letters that were read by Henry's men before being delivered, but they couldn't see each other, couldn't touch each other, couldn't comfort each other. Mary received a letter from Catherine in December 1535 that described her mother's declining health. Catherine wrote that she was coughing blood, that her abdomen was swollen and painful, that she could barely eat. Mary begged Henry for permission to visit her. He refused. Catherine died in January 1536, and Mary was not allowed to attend the funeral. She was 20 years old, and she never got to say goodbye. That grief twisted into rage. Mary blamed Anne Boleyn for destroying her parents' marriage. When Anne was executed just 5 months later, Mary reportedly said, "God has begun his work." She wasn't sad, she was satisfied. But Mary's suffering didn't end with Anne's death. She was still illegitimate. Henry pressured her for years to sign a document acknowledging that her parents' marriage had been invalid, that she was a bastard. She refused over and over, even when refusing meant risking her life. Finally, in 1536, after months of isolation and threats, Mary broke. She signed. She declared herself a bastard, acknowledged Henry as supreme head of the church, and renounced the Pope's authority. It shattered something in her. She'd betrayed her mother's memory, violated her own conscience, and humiliated herself publicly, all to save her life. The document she signed still exists in the National Archives. You can see where her handwriting deteriorates toward the end, the letters becoming shaky and barely legible, as if her hand was trembling so badly she could hardly hold the pen. After that, Mary lived in a kind of suspended existence for years. She was occasionally allowed at court, but never secure. Henry's mood toward her shifted constantly, sometimes affectionate, sometimes cold. She never knew if she'd wake up restored to favour or arrested for treason. She developed chronic stress-related health problems, debilitating headaches, irregular menstruation that sometimes caused her to go months without bleeding, and then bleed so heavily she was bedridden, and frequent bouts of what was probably severe depression, where she couldn't eat or get out of bed. When Mary finally became queen in 1553, she was 37 years old, unmarried, traumatised, and consumed by bitterness. Her reign was short, just 5 years, but it was defined by one thing: her attempt to drag England back to Catholicism by force. She burned Protestant heretics by the hundreds. The burnings took place at Smithfield, a public square in London, and they became spectacles. Crowds gathered to watch. Vendors sold food and ale. Children were lifted onto parents' shoulders for a better view. The victims were tied to stakes with chains. Wood was piled around their legs. Sometimes friends or family were allowed to tie bags of gunpowder around the victim's neck. An act of mercy, because if the powder exploded when the flames reached it, it would kill them quickly rather than letting them roast slowly. But the powder didn't always ignite. Sometimes it was damp. Sometimes the flames didn't reach high enough fast enough. And then victims would scream and thrash in the chains as their skin blackened and split, as their hair burned away, as their eyes boiled in their sockets. One victim, John Hooper, Bishop of Gloucester, took 45 minutes to die because the wood was green and wet. Witnesses reported that he begged the crowd to add more wood, to make the fire burn hotter so he'd die faster. His legs burned away to charred bone while he was still conscious, still praying aloud. Mary attended some of these burnings. She believed she was doing God's work, purifying England, saving souls by punishing heretics. She couldn't see that she'd become the monster she'd once feared, and she died alone. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was loveless. He'd married her for political advantage and spent most of his time abroad. She had what she believed were 2 pregnancies, but both were phantom pregnancies caused by tumours or hormonal imbalances. She swelled up, felt movement in her abdomen, prepared nurseries, and then nothing. No baby, just the devastating realisation that her body had betrayed her again. She died in November 1558, probably from uterine or ovarian cancer. Her abdomen distended, in constant pain. Her final words were reportedly about Elizabeth: "I pray God she prove not as ungracious to England as I fear she will." Even at the end, she couldn't let go of the bitterness. But if Arthur had lived, Mary's life would have been unrecognisable. She would have grown up as a princess, not a bastard. She would have been educated, honoured, and protected. If Catherine had no sons, Mary might have been groomed as Arthur's heir. An unprecedented move, yes, but not impossible. And here's a crucial detail. Arthur had been influenced by his grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, one of the most powerful women in English history. Margaret had essentially ruled England as regent during Henry VII's early reign, and she'd been a strong advocate for women's education and legal rights within the very limited framework of the 16th century. If Margaret had lived longer, she died in 1509, the day after Henry VIII's coronation, she might have influenced Arthur to see Mary as a viable heir. If Mary had been raised as the unquestioned heir to the throne, if she had been legitimised and supported from birth, she wouldn't have been the angry, desperate woman who became Bloody Mary. She would have been confident, educated, prepared. She might have married young, formed a strong alliance, and ruled with the confidence of someone who had always known she was meant to lead. She might have been a great queen. Think about it. Mary was intelligent. She spoke Latin, French, and Spanish fluently. She understood theology, politics, and court intrigue. Her problem wasn't lack of ability. It was lack of opportunity combined with decades of psychological abuse. She was sidelined, humiliated, and traumatized, and by the time she finally gained power, she was too damaged to wield it effectively. But in a world where Arthur ruled, where Catherine remained queen, where Mary grew up secure in her position, she would have had a completely different foundation. Or, and this is equally possible, she might never have ruled at all. Because if Arthur had remarried after Catherine's death, if he had produced a son with a second wife, Mary would have been pushed aside anyway. Not cruelly perhaps, but still sidelined. Because in the 16th century, even a beloved daughter couldn't compete with a son. But let's say Arthur never remarried. Let's say Catherine lived long enough to see Mary grow into adulthood, and Arthur, recognising that he would have no other heirs, began preparing Mary to rule. This would have required a massive shift in thinking. England had never been ruled by a queen regnant. The closest precedent was Matilda in the 12th century, and her claim to the throne had sparked a 19-year civil war called the Anarchy. The idea of a woman ruling in her own right was radical, dangerous, and deeply controversial. Medieval and early modern political theory was built on the assumption that women were intellectually, morally, and physically inferior to men. The very concept of female rule violated natural law, or so scholars argued. How could a woman command armies? How could she make life or death decisions? How could she resist the manipulations of male advisors and foreign kings? But Arthur, if he was the thoughtful diplomatic king we imagine, might have made it work. He might have negotiated with Parliament, secured oaths of loyalty, and ensured that Mary's succession was uncontested. He might have publicly demonstrated Mary's capability by including her in council meetings, having her sign documents, allowing her to hear petitions and render judgments. And if Mary had become queen under those circumstances, legitimised, supported, and prepared, she would have been one of the most formidable rulers in English history. She wouldn't have needed to prove herself by burning heretics. She wouldn't have been desperate to restore Catholicism, because Catholicism would never have been threatened in the first place. She would have ruled with the confidence of someone who had always belonged on the throne. But here's the dark side. If Mary had ruled as a Catholic queen in a still Catholic England, she would have faced the same pressures Arthur did. The Protestant Reformation was happening whether England liked it or not. And if Mary had tried to suppress it, if she had used force to maintain Catholic orthodoxy, she might have earned her bloody nickname anyway. Because the problem wasn't just Henry VIII's cruelty or Mary's bitterness. The problem was the era itself. The 16th century was a time of religious upheaval, and no ruler, no matter how capable, could avoid the violence that came with it. Still, Mary under Arthur would have been different. She would have had a foundation of legitimacy, a childhood free from trauma, and a kingdom that wasn't already fractured by her father's ego. She might not have been a saint, but she wouldn't have been a villain either. And that perhaps is the saddest part of Mary's real story. She had the potential to be great, but Henry VIII destroyed her before she ever got the chance. Now let's talk about the woman who, in our timeline, became one of the greatest monarchs in history. Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and Henry VIII, born in 1533. But here's the thing. If Arthur had lived, if Anne Boleyn had never caught Henry's eye, Elizabeth would never have been born. There would be no Virgin Queen, no Elizabethan Golden Age, no defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, when English ships harried and burned the massive Spanish fleet as it tried to invade England. No Shakespeare writing under royal patronage at the Globe Theatre. No Francis Drake circumnavigating the world and bringing back Spanish gold. No Walter Raleigh establishing the first English colonies in Virginia. The entire cultural and political legacy that we associate with Elizabeth I, the Renaissance flowering, the maritime supremacy, the sense of English national identity, it simply wouldn't exist. And honestly, that's one of the most devastating consequences of this alternate timeline. Because Elizabeth, for all her flaws, was extraordinary. She was brilliant, politically savvy, and ruthless when necessary. She inherited a kingdom torn apart by a religious conflict and economic instability, and she turned it into a formidable power. She never married, never allowed herself to be controlled by a husband or manipulated by foreign kings. She played the game better than almost anyone, and she did it while constantly facing the assumption that, as a woman, she was unfit to rule. But here's what's rarely discussed. Elizabeth's childhood was a horror show that would have destroyed most people. She was born in September 1533, and from the moment she emerged, she was a disappointment. Henry had been so sure she'd be a boy that he'd already had announcements prepared declaring the birth of a prince. When Elizabeth was born female, the announcements had to be hastily amended, an extra S added to turn prince into princess. It was humiliating for Henry and ominous for Anne. Elizabeth was only 2 years old when her mother was arrested. She was too young to understand what was happening, but she must have sensed something. Anne was taken to the Tower in May 1536. Elizabeth never saw her again. Here's a detail that's often overlooked. After Anne's execution, Elizabeth's household staff was dismissed almost immediately. The servants who had cared for her since birth were sent away. Her governess, who'd been like a mother to her, was removed. Elizabeth, at age 2, was left with strangers in a house where no one was quite sure what her status was anymore. Was she still a princess? Was she a bastard? Could she inherit the throne? No one knew. Henry had declared her illegitimate, just as he'd done with Mary, but he hadn't clarified what that meant for her future. So Elizabeth existed in limbo, a child with royal blood, but no clear place in the world. She was dressed in clothing that was too small because no one would authorise funds for new clothes for a bastard. Her shoes had holes in them. One of her governesses wrote to Thomas Cromwell, begging for money to buy fabric for a new dress, because Elizabeth's current clothes were too short and too tight, and she was ashamed to bring the child to court, looking like a pauper. As Elizabeth grew older, she learned to survive by being invisible. She was quiet, obedient, and careful never to draw attention to herself. She learned to read people, to sense danger before it arrived, to say nothing that could be used against her. When she was 8 years old, her father married Catherine Howard. Elizabeth was old enough by then to understand what that meant. Another queen, another potential source of danger. When Catherine was arrested for adultery, Elizabeth saw what happened to queens who displeased the king. She learned that even being royal wasn't enough to protect you. You had to be smart, careful, and always 3 steps ahead. By the time Elizabeth was a teenager, she'd survived more political upheaval than most adults ever experience. She'd seen 3 of her father's wives executed or divorced. She'd watched her half-sister Mary be stripped of her title and humiliated. She'd learned that power was fragile. that favour could disappear overnight, and that the only person you could really trust was yourself. When Henry died in 1547, Elizabeth was 13 years old. Her half-brother Edward became king, and for a brief period things seemed stable. But then Thomas Seymour, Catherine Parr's husband after Henry, began making inappropriate advances toward Elizabeth. Seymour was in his late 30s. Elizabeth was 14. He would come into her bedroom early in the morning, wearing only his nightshirt, and tickle her while she was still in bed. He would slap her buttocks. He would make sexual jokes. Catherine Parr initially laughed along, but eventually she realised this wasn't playful. It was predatory. When Catherine died in childbirth in 1548, Seymour tried to marry Elizabeth. She was 15. He was using her, trying to gain power through a marriage to a royal princess, even a bastard one. When his plans were discovered, he was arrested and executed for treason. Elizabeth was interrogated. At age 15, she was questioned by the King's Council about whether she'd encouraged Seymour's advances, whether she'd had sexual contact with him, whether she'd agreed to marry him. She had to discuss intimate details of what had happened in her bedroom, while powerful men recorded her answers and looked for inconsistencies that could be used to charge her with treason. She survived by being smarter than her interrogators. She admitted nothing that could be used against her. She portrayed herself as an innocent victim of an older man's manipulation. And she learned another crucial lesson. Men would always try to use her sexuality against her. When Edward died in 1553 and Mary became queen, Elizabeth's life became even more precarious. Mary suspected Elizabeth of being a Protestant sympathiser, which she was, and potentially a focus for Protestant rebellion. When Wyatt's rebellion erupted in 1554, trying to overthrow Mary and put Elizabeth on the throne, Elizabeth was arrested and sent to the Tower. She was 20 years old, and she was being taken to the same place where her mother had been executed. She must have thought she was going to die. Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower for 2 months in the same set of rooms where Anne Boleyn had spent her final days. She could see Tower Green from her window, the spot where her mother had been beheaded. She must have looked at that patch of ground and wondered if she'd die there too. But Mary couldn't find enough evidence to execute her. Elizabeth had been careful, as always, so she was released but kept under house arrest for another year, watched constantly, forbidden from receiving visitors, living in permanent limbo between freedom and execution. When Mary died in 1558 and Elizabeth finally became queen at age 25, she'd already survived more assassination attempts, more political plots, more threats to her life than most monarchs face in an entire reign. And all of that trauma, all of that careful survival, made her the queen she became. She trusted no one. She refused to marry because marriage meant giving power to a husband. She played foreign suitors against each other for decades, promising marriage but never committing, using her unmarried status as a diplomatic tool. She was ruthless when necessary. She executed Mary, Queen of Scots, her own cousin, after years of keeping her imprisoned. She waged brutal campaigns in Ireland that killed thousands. She presided over a kingdom that was still deeply unequal, still scarred by religious violence, but she also brought stability. She established the Elizabethan religious settlement, which tried to find a middle ground between Catholicism and Protestantism. She patronised the arts, creating an environment where theatre, poetry, and music flourished. She defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, one of the greatest naval victories in English history, and she created a sense of English national identity that hadn't existed before. Her speeches were masterpieces of rhetoric. Before the Armada battle, she rode among her troops at Tilbury wearing armour and gave a speech that's still quoted today. "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." She turned her weakness, her gender, into strength. She made her unmarried status a virtue, calling herself married to England. She created an image of herself as the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, good Queen Bess, a ruler who needed no man because she was wedded to her people. It was propaganda, yes, but it was brilliant propaganda. And it worked. Without Elizabeth, England would have been a different place, and not necessarily a better one. But let's step back. Let's imagine Arthur's England in the 1550s and 1560s, the years when Elizabeth would have been ruling in our timeline. What does that England look like? If Mary had succeeded Arthur and ruled as a Catholic queen, she might have faced challenges from Protestant factions. But without the violent break from Rome that Henry caused, those factions would have been smaller, less organised, less radical. If Mary had married and produced an heir, the succession would have been secure. England would have remained Catholic, aligned with Spain, and deeply suspicious of Protestant neighbours. But if Mary had died childless, or if Arthur had no heirs at all, England would have faced a succession crisis, and that crisis would have been messy, bloody, and potentially catastrophic. Because without a clear Tudor heir, multiple factions would have claimed the throne. The Yorkist line, which still had descendants, might have pressed their claim, though by the 1560s, those claims were distant and weak. Scotland, through the Stuart line, might have intervened. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Henry VII's great-granddaughter, through his daughter Margaret Tudor. Spain might have tried to install a puppet king, someone who would keep England Catholic and allied with Spanish interests. England could have fractured. It could have become a battleground, a pawn in the larger European power struggles between Catholic and Protestant nations. And here's the brutal irony. Henry VIII's chaos, his break with Rome, his 6 wives, his desperation for a son, all of that, as destructive as it was, actually kept England united. Because Henry, for all his faults, left behind 3 legitimate heirs, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. And even though Edward died young and Mary's reign was short, the succession was clear. There was always someone next in line. Without Henry, without his ruthless consolidation of power, England might have splintered into civil war. So maybe, in some twisted way, Henry's brutality saved England from something worse. His willingness to execute anyone who stood in his way, to break with 1,000-year-old institutions, to tear the kingdom apart and rebuild it in his image. Maybe all of that was necessary to create a strong enough foundation that England could survive the religious wars of the 16th century. But that doesn't make it right. It doesn't erase the suffering he caused. It doesn't bring back the women he destroyed. It just means that history is complicated, and sometimes the worst people leave behind the strongest legacies. Still, the absence of Elizabeth is a loss we can't ignore. Because Elizabeth wasn't just a queen, she was a symbol, a woman who proved that female rulers could be just as capable, just as ruthless, just as visionary as any king. Without her, that precedent might never have been set. And the fight for women's equality, already centuries long, might have been even harder. Here's something I want you to think about as you're lying there tonight, maybe already half asleep, maybe still turning this over in your mind. Elizabeth survived her childhood through intelligence and caution. But what if survival itself wasn't enough? What if being the smartest person in the room, the most careful, the most strategic, still isn't enough to protect you in a system designed to destroy you? How many brilliant women never got the chance to prove what they could do because they weren't lucky enough to survive long enough? Let that question sit with you. Even under Arthur, Protestant ideas would have seeped into England. Martin Luther's writings were already circulating by the 1520s. John Calvin was preaching in Geneva. Merchants brought pamphlets hidden in barrels. Students returned from continental universities with new ideas. And once people started questioning the Pope's authority, there was no going back. Arthur would have faced an impossible choice: suppress these ideas brutally, or allow limited reform and risk Rome's wrath. If he chose suppression, England would have needed its own Inquisition. burnings, torture, families torn apart, all the violence Henry caused, but in service of Rome instead of against it. If he chose tolerance, he would have alienated conservative Catholics and potentially faced rebellion from within his own kingdom. There was no good choice, just different kinds of blood. In our timeline, Henry's break came in the 1530s, quick, decisive, violent. If Arthur had delayed it, the break might have come in the 1560s. When all of Europe was already burning, England might have been pulled into the French wars of religion or the Dutch revolt, dragged into conflicts that lasted decades and killed millions. So maybe Henry's timing, brutal as it was, saved England from something worse. Or maybe that's just how we rationalise the actions of terrible people. Under Arthur, the 800+ monasteries of England would have remained. They would have continued feeding the poor, housing the sick, and preserving manuscripts. When Henry dissolved them, he seized approximately £1.3 million, equivalent to tens of billions today, and redistributed the land to loyal nobles, creating a new aristocracy that owed everything to the crown. Without that windfall, Arthur's England would have been poorer, but it also would have had a functioning social safety net. The poor wouldn't have been quite so desperate. The wealth gap wouldn't have widened as dramatically. Still, the monasteries weren't saints. Many were corrupt, wealthy, and deeply unpopular. By the 1520s, reform was necessary. Arthur might have tried to reform them from within, curbing excesses while preserving their social function. But that would have required delicate manoeuvring, constant negotiation, and eventually compromise that pleased no one. The preservation of the monasteries would have been a net positive, but it wouldn't have fixed everything, because even with them intact, the 16th century was still a time of plague, famine, and violence. Henry VIII's wars were expensive, pointless disasters. His 1513 French campaign cost 4 years of royal revenue and achieved nothing but the capture of Terouanne and Tournai, 2 small towns that England couldn't afford to garrison. During that campaign, more English soldiers died from dysentery than combat. Men shit themselves to death in field tents, their intestines liquefying from bacterial infection. The smell was so overwhelming that horses refused to enter certain parts of the camp. His 1544 campaign was even worse. He besieged Boulogne at enormous cost, over £2 million, which bankrupted the treasury and forced Henry to debase the coinage. English silver coins were mixed with copper until they contained only 1/3 silver, causing massive inflation. The price of bread tripled within 2 years. The poor starved while Henry built fortifications he couldn't maintain. Arthur wouldn't have done that. He would have understood that England's strength lay in trade, not conquest. But avoiding war doesn't mean avoiding all conflict. Arthur would have needed to defend against French or Scottish aggression. The difference is that he would have fought defensively, not offensively. This would have saved lives and money, but it also would have made Arthur less legendary. History remembers warriors, not peacekeepers. Arthur's relationship with Scotland would have been his greatest diplomatic challenge. In our timeline, Henry's aggressive policies towards Scotland culminated in the Battle of Flodden in 1513, where James IV of Scotland was killed along with most of Scotland's nobility. An estimated 10,000 men died in a single afternoon. But that disaster was preventable, and Arthur, unlike Henry, would have prevented it. Here's why. Arthur's sister, Margaret Tudor, had married James IV in 1503 as part of the Treaty of Perpetual Peace. This wasn't just a political arrangement. By all accounts, James and Margaret actually cared for each other. They had children together. They built a life together. And James honoured the treaty for a decade. The treaty only broke down when Henry invaded France in 1513, forcing Scotland to choose between its alliance with England, through Margaret, and its traditional alliance with France, the Auld Alliance. James chose France, invaded northern England, and died at Flodden. But if Arthur had been king, there would have been no French invasion. No reason for Scotland to activate the old alliance. No Flodden. Instead, Arthur would have nurtured the relationship with Scotland through Margaret. He would have supported her regency after James IV's eventual natural death, helped stabilise Scotland politically, and used the family connection to build a genuine alliance. And here's where it gets really interesting. Margaret's son, James V, would have grown up with his uncle, Arthur, as an ally, not an enemy. James V's daughter Mary, Queen of Scots, might never have been sent to France as a child to escape English aggression. The entire tragic arc of Mary's life, her marriages, her conspiracies, her eventual execution by Elizabeth, might never have happened. If Arthur had maintained peace with Scotland, there's a real possibility that England and Scotland could have been unified peacefully in the 1540s or 1550s, decades before it actually happened in 1603, when James VI of Scotland became James I of England. This would have changed everything. A unified Britain, Catholic, allied with Spain, with no history of brutal border warfare. It sounds utopian, but the underlying tensions wouldn't have disappeared. The border lords, the clans, the old families, they had been raiding and feuding for generations. They wouldn't have stopped just because a king signed a treaty. Arthur would have had to work constantly to maintain the peace, sending money, support, diplomacy. It would have been exhausting, but it would have been worth it, because a peaceful northern border would have freed England to focus on other things: trade, culture, exploration. Instead of spending decades fighting Scotland, England could have been building ships, establishing trade routes, investing in education. The English Renaissance might have started earlier. English power might have grown faster. But here's a darker possibility. Without the constant threat from Scotland, England might have grown complacent. Sometimes conflict drives innovation. Sometimes enemies make you stronger. So let me ask you this, and really sit with this question as you're listening. Do you think peace is always worth the effort, even when it requires constant vigilance and compromise? Or do you think sometimes conflict is inevitable, and all we can do is try to survive it with some shred of decency intact? Consider that as we move forward. Let's talk about Spain. Because in the early 16th century, Spain wasn't just a country, it was the most powerful empire on earth. Ferdinand and Isabella had united Aragon and Castile, completed the Reconquista by conquering Granada, expelled the Jews, and funded Columbus's voyage to the New World. Their grandson, Charles V, ruled Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy, and vast territories in the Americas. Spain was the dominant force in European politics, and England's alliance with Spain, sealed by Catherine of Aragon's marriage, was supposed to be the cornerstone of English foreign policy. But Henry destroyed that alliance. When he annulled his marriage to Catherine, he didn't just humiliate a queen, he insulted Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. Charles was furious. He pressured the Pope to deny Henry's annulment. He supported Catherine and Mary. And when Henry broke with Rome, Charles saw him as a heretic, a threat, and a potential enemy. The alliance was destroyed, and for the rest of Henry's reign, England had to navigate a dangerous diplomatic landscape, caught between Spain, France, and the Protestant powers of Northern Europe. But if Arthur had lived, if he had remained married to Catherine, the alliance with Spain would have held, and that would have given England unprecedented security and influence. With Spain as an ally, England would have been protected from French aggression. Spanish gold from the New World would have flowed into English coffers through trade. English merchants would have had access to Spanish ports, Spanish colonies, Spanish markets. England would have been part of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But here's the uncomfortable part. Being allied with Spain also meant being complicit in Spain's actions. And Spain, in the early 16th century, was not a gentle power. This was the age of the Spanish Inquisition. Between 1478 and 1834, the Spanish Inquisition prosecuted approximately 150,000 people for heresy, Judaism, Islam, or other religious crimes. About 3,000 to 5,000 were executed, most by burning. But the numbers don't capture the horror. Here's how an auto da fe worked. The condemned were dressed in yellow robes, called sanbenitos, marked with flames and devils. They were paraded through the streets, while crowds jeered and threw garbage. Those who recanted their heresies, at the last moment, were mercifully strangled before burning. Those who refused were burned alive. The Inquisition kept detailed records. We know the names of victims, their crimes, their final words. One woman, Elvira del Campo, was accused of not eating pork, evidence of secret Judaism. She was tortured on the rack, her joints dislocated, until she confessed. Another man, Gabriel de Granada, was burned for owning a Hebrew Bible. His crime, reading scripture in the wrong language. If England had remained allied with Spain, English priests might have participated in the Inquisition. English ships might have transported prisoners to Spanish territories for trial. English merchants would have profited from the system. And then there's the Americas. Spain's conquest of the New World was one of the greatest acts of genocide in human history. The indigenous population of the Americas before European contact is estimated at 50 to 100 million. By 1600, it had declined to about 6 million, a 90% population loss caused by disease, warfare, enslavement, and deliberate extermination. Spanish conquistadors destroyed entire civilizations. The Aztec Empire fell to Hernán Cortés in 1521. The Inca Empire fell to Francisco Pizarro in 1533. Millions of indigenous people were enslaved in mines and plantations, worked to death, extracting silver and gold that enriched Spain. The encomienda system essentially legalized slavery under the guise of Christian protection. Spanish settlers were granted land and all the indigenous people living on it, whom they could force to work in exchange for religious instruction. In practice, it was slavery. Indigenous people were worked to death in silver mines in Potosí, where the altitude alone, over 13,000 feet, made breathing difficult, and where toxic mercury used in silver extraction caused tremors, madness, and death. One chronicler, Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who witnessed the conquest, wrote that he saw indigenous children worked so hard that they died like flies. He described Spanish dogs trained to hunt and tear apart indigenous people who tried to escape. He described mass executions where hundreds were hanged or burned at once as warnings to others. If England had remained allied with Spain, it would have been part of this system. English ships might have carried enslaved people from Africa to American plantations, which they eventually did anyway, but perhaps earlier and more systematically. English merchants would have profited from the theft of indigenous land and labour. Arthur, for all his supposed wisdom and diplomacy, would have had to make a choice: support Spain's actions or risk losing the alliance. And honestly, he probably would have supported them. Because in the 16th century, morality was different. The concept of human rights didn't exist. Conquest, slavery, forced conversion, these were seen as normal, even righteous, if they served the interest of Christendom and brought wealth to Christian kingdoms. Arthur wouldn't have questioned Spain's methods any more than he would have questioned his own right to rule. He would have accepted the alliance, taken the benefits, and turned a blind eye to the atrocities. And that's the dark side of this alternate timeline. Because while Arthur might have been a better king than Henry in many ways, kinder to his wife, less tyrannical, more diplomatic, he would still have been a product of his time. And his time was brutal. The alliance with Spain would have made England wealthier and more powerful. It would have protected England from invasion, but it also would have made England complicit in some of the worst crimes of the early modern era. So when we imagine Arthur's England as more peaceful, more stable, we have to remember, peace for whom? Stability for whom? Because Arthur's subjects might have been better off, but the people Spain conquered and enslaved certainly wouldn't have been. And that's a question we need to sit with. Because it's easy to imagine alternate histories where things are simply better. But history isn't simple, and better for some often means worse for others. Here's something that fundamentally changes world history. If Arthur had ruled, the British Empire as we know it might never have existed. That sounds absurd. Britain dominated a quarter of the world for centuries. The sun never set on the British Empire. How could one different king change that? But think about the chain of events. The British Empire was built on naval power, exploration, and colonisation. And all of that was funded, at least in part, by the wealth Henry VIII seized from the monasteries. When Henry dissolved the monasteries in the 1530s, he seized approximately £1.3 million, roughly £300 billion in today's money. He also seized their lands, which constituted about 25% of all land in England. He sold or granted these lands to supporters, creating a new aristocracy that owed everything to the crown. But Henry didn't just pocket the money. He invested it in the Royal Navy. He commissioned new ships, the Mary Rose, the Henri Grâce à Dieu, and dozens of others. He built dockyards, established naval infrastructure, and created the foundation of English sea power. Arthur wouldn't have done that. The monasteries would have kept their wealth, the crown would have remained relatively poor, and England, instead of investing in ships and exploration, would have focused on maintaining its alliance with Spain and staying out of European conflicts. This might sound like a good thing. Stability, peace, prosperity. But it also means England would have missed out on the age of exploration. In our timeline, English explorers like John Cabot, 1497, Francis Drake, 1577 to 1580, and Walter Raleigh, 1584, ventured into the Atlantic, claimed lands in North America, and laid the groundwork for British colonisation. But those expeditions required money, ships, and royal support. If Arthur's England was focused on maintaining its Catholic identity and its alliance with Spain, it might not have invested in exploration. Spain already dominated the Americas. Portugal controlled the trade routes to Africa and Asia, and under the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, which divided the New World between Spain and Portugal with the Pope's blessing, there wasn't much room for other Catholic nations to stake claims. If England had remained Catholic, if it had respected the Pope's authority, it might have accepted Spain's dominance and focused on European trade instead of overseas expansion. And that would have been catastrophic for England's long-term power. Because the wealth of the Americas, the gold, the silver, the sugar, the tobacco, the cotton, transformed Europe. Spain became fabulously wealthy in the 16th century, so wealthy that it could afford to wage constant wars across Europe. The Spanish treasure fleets brought so much silver from Potosi that it caused inflation throughout Europe, the price revolution, where the value of silver declined because there was so much of it in circulation. Later, France, the Netherlands, and England all built empires of their own, competing for colonies, trade routes, and resources. The wealth generated by colonialism funded industrialization, technological development, and military expansion. But if England had sat on the sidelines, if it had remained a second-tier European power focused on diplomacy rather than conquest, it would have been left behind. By the 17th century, when other European powers were colonizing the world, England would have been weak, isolated, and irrelevant. And without British colonization, the history of North America, India, Australia, and dozens of other regions would have been completely different. So here's the irony. Henry VIII, the king we remember as brutal and destructive, laid the groundwork for England's future greatness. His break with Rome freed England from Spanish influence. His seizure of monastery wealth funded the navy. His encouragement of English Protestantism created a sense of national identity that set England apart from Catholic Europe. Without Henry, England would have been just another Catholic kingdom, overshadowed by Spain and France, unable to compete in the new global economy. So maybe Henry's cruelty served a purpose. Maybe his chaos, his selfishness, his willingness to destroy institutions and execute anyone who stood in his way. Maybe all of that was necessary for England to become what it eventually became. Or maybe that's just how we rationalize the actions of terrible people. Maybe we tell ourselves that their crimes were necessary because we can't accept that history is random, that good things can come from bad people, and that there's no grand plan guiding any of it. Either way, the fact remains, if Arthur had ruled, the British Empire probably wouldn't have existed, and the world we live in today would be unrecognisable. Let's push this further. If England had never built a global empire, what would have happened to North America? In our timeline, England established its first permanent colony at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Over the next century, English settlers spread along the Atlantic coast, establishing the 13 colonies that would eventually become the United States. But if Arthur had ruled, if England had never invested in overseas exploration, Jamestown might never have been founded. The eastern coast of North America would have been up for grabs, and the most likely colonizer? Spain. Spain already controlled Florida, established 1565, Mexico, Central America, and most of South America. If England wasn't competing for territory, Spain might have pushed northward, claiming the Atlantic coast and establishing Spanish colonies where English ones would have been. Imagine, instead of Virginia, New England, and New York, we'd have Nueva Inglaterra, Nueva Virginia, and Nueva York. The dominant language would be Spanish, not English. The dominant religion would be Catholicism, not Protestantism. The entire cultural, legal, and social structure would be Hispanic, rather than Anglo-Saxon. Or France might have expanded. France controlled Canada, New France, and the Mississippi River Valley, Louisiana. Without English competition, France might have claimed more of the eastern seaboard, creating a vast French empire in North America. Either way, there would be no United States as we know it. The American Revolution was driven by English colonists who saw themselves as Englishmen with English rights, the right to representation, to trial by jury, to self-governance. These were English traditions rooted in centuries of parliamentary struggle against royal authority. Spanish colonists didn't have that tradition. Spain was an absolute monarchy where the king's word was law. Colonial governors ruled with near total authority. There was no expectation of self-governance or representation. So if Spain had colonized North America, there might never have been an American Revolution. Or if there had been independence movements, they would have looked more like the Latin American revolutions of the early 19th century, violent, prolonged struggles that often resulted in military dictatorships rather than stable democracies. Instead of the United States, North America might have been divided between New Spain and New France, two colonial territories controlled by European monarchies. And when those colonies eventually gained independence, the countries that emerged would have been very different from the United States we know. They might have been more authoritarian, more Catholic, more socially stratified. They might have experienced the same cycles of revolution and dictatorship that plagued Latin America for centuries. Or maybe they would have been better, more egalitarian, more inclusive, less obsessed with individualism and capitalism. We can't know. But what we do know is that the United States, as it exists today, with its constitution, its democratic traditions, its global influence, exists because England colonized North America. And England only colonized North America because Henry VIII broke with Rome, seized monastic wealth, and set England on a path toward global power. If Arthur had ruled, none of that would have happened, and the world we live in today would be fundamentally different. But let's bring this back to something more human, because for all the talk about empires and alliances and religious wars, the most important question is this: would life have been better for ordinary people if Arthur had ruled instead of Henry? And honestly, for most people, probably not. Because the fundamental problems of the 16th century, poverty, disease, inequality, violence, weren't caused by Henry VIII. They were caused by the structure of society itself. Women would still have been treated as property. They would still have been married off as teenagers, forced to bear child after child, denied any real power or autonomy. In Arthur's England, women would still have had no legal rights. A married woman couldn't own property. Everything belonged to her husband. She couldn't sign contracts, sue in court, or control her own money. If her husband beat her, there was no recourse. Domestic violence was not only legal, but expected. Husbands had the right and duty to discipline their wives. Childbirth would still have been the leading cause of death for women of childbearing age. Between 1500 and 1800, approximately 1 in 40 women died in childbirth for each pregnancy. Women who had 6 or 7 children, which was typical, had about a 1 in 6 lifetime risk of dying in childbirth. Those are Russian roulette odds, and the process was horrific. Labour could last days. Pain relief was virtually non-existent. Maybe wine, maybe herbs that did nothing. Midwives had no understanding of hygiene. They examined women with unwashed hands, used unsterilised tools, and had no way to stop hemorrhaging or infection. If a baby was positioned wrong, breech, transverse, or otherwise stuck, there were only a few options. The midwife could try to turn the baby manually, reaching inside and attempting to reposition it, which often caused tearing and infection, or they could use hooks to pull the baby out in pieces if it was already dead. A gruesome process that traumatised everyone involved and often killed the mother too. If the mother died, the baby usually died as well, unless it was old enough to survive on wet nurse milk. And if the mother survived but the baby died, she was expected to get pregnant again immediately. There was no time to grieve, no sympathy for her loss. Her job was to produce heirs, and she'd failed. Under Arthur, none of this would have changed. Women would have continued to die in childbirth at the same rate, would have continued to suffer under the same legal restrictions, would have continued to be valued primarily for their reproductive capacity. Peasants would still have lived in filth. The enclosure movement, which drove thousands of people off common lands and into poverty, was already underway in the early 1500s and would have continued under Arthur. Landowners were discovering they could make more money raising sheep for wool than renting land to tenant farmers. So they evicted farmers, fenced off common land, and converted arable fields to pasture. This created massive social disruption. Families who'd farmed the same land for generations were suddenly homeless. Villages were abandoned. People flooded into cities looking for work, overwhelming the limited urban infrastructure. The result? Crime exploded, disease spread faster, and the poor suffered immensely. London in the 16th century was a nightmare of overcrowding, filth, and violence. The streets were literally running with human waste. Plague hit every few years, killing thousands. And there was no safety net. If you couldn't work, you starved. Arthur wouldn't have stopped this. He might have been slightly more sympathetic than Henry, might have implemented some minor poor laws, but he couldn't have reversed the economic forces driving enclosure. Landowners were too powerful, and the wool trade was too profitable. Religious minorities would still have faced persecution. Even if Arthur had kept England Catholic and avoided the violent break with Rome, there would still have been heretics, dissidents, people who thought differently, and they would have been punished. The Catholic Church had its own methods of enforcing orthodoxy. The Inquisition might not have operated officially in England under Arthur, but there would have been heresy trials, burnings, and executions. Anyone who questioned Catholic doctrine, who owned forbidden books, who spoke against the church, they would have been arrested, interrogated, possibly tortured, and potentially executed. And slavery. If England had remained allied with Spain, it would have participated in the Atlantic slave trade just as enthusiastically as it did in our timeline, just perhaps earlier and more systematically. The Atlantic slave trade didn't begin with England. It began with Portugal in the 1440s and was quickly adopted by Spain. By the time Arthur would have been ruling in the 1510s to 1540s, Spanish and Portuguese ships were already transporting enslaved Africans to American plantations. If England had been allied with Spain, English merchants would have wanted a piece of that trade. English ships would have sailed to West Africa, purchased or captured enslaved people, transported them across the Atlantic in horrific conditions, chained below deck, barely fed, lying in their own waste, with mortality rates of 10 to 20% during the voyage, and sold them to Spanish plantation owners. Arthur wouldn't have opposed this. Slavery was not seen as morally wrong in the 16th century, at least not by European Christians. It was seen as natural, even biblically justified. The idea that all humans had equal rights, that slavery was a crime against humanity, those were Enlightenment ideas that wouldn't emerge for another 2 centuries. So let's not romanticize Arthur's England. Let's not pretend that a kinder king would have created a kinder world. The 16th century was brutal for everyone except the very rich and very powerful, and even they lived in constant fear of disease, assassination, and political intrigue. Arthur might have been more diplomatic than Henry. He might have avoided some wars, preserved some institutions, caused less direct suffering, but he couldn't have changed the fundamental nature of his time. Because those changes required more than a good king. They required revolutions, social, political, intellectual revolutions that took centuries to unfold. Arthur, like Henry, was a product of his time, and his time was unforgiving. Here's the thing about alternate history. It's not really about what might have been. It's about what was. We imagine Arthur ruling England so we can better understand Henry. We imagine a peaceful, Catholic England so we can appreciate how chaotic, how transformative, how brutal the Reformation actually was. And we imagine all the women who would have been spared, Catherine, Anne, Jane, the others, so we can honour the women who weren't spared, so we can remember that their suffering wasn't inevitable, that history could have gone differently. Because in our timeline, those women suffered. They were used, discarded, and destroyed by a system that valued them only as vessels for male heirs, as political pawns, as disposable commodities. And yes, Henry was a monster. But he was a monster created by that system. If Arthur had been desperate for a son, if he had faced the same pressures, the same fears, the same impossible expectations, would he really have behaved so differently? Maybe, maybe not. We like to think that good people would make better choices, that intelligence and education lead to wisdom and compassion. But history suggests otherwise. History suggests that power corrupts eventually, that desperation drives even the best people to terrible acts, that structural evil is stronger than individual virtue. Arthur might have been a better man than Henry, but he still would have been a man in a world that gave men absolute power and women none. He still would have ruled in an age of violence, disease, and inequality. He still would have made compromises, turned blind eyes to atrocities, prioritised stability over justice. And that's the real tragedy, not just what happened, but what keeps happening. Because the structures that oppressed women in the 16th century, the belief that women exist to serve men, that their worth is tied to their fertility, that their voices don't matter, those structures still exist today, just in different forms. We've made progress, yes. Women can vote, own property, work, divorce, control their own bodies, at least in theory, at least in some places. But we're still fighting the same battles, still arguing about whether women deserve bodily autonomy, still watching as powerful men abuse their power and face few consequences, still living in a world where gender-based violence is endemic and often excused. So maybe the question isn't whether Arthur would have been a better king. Maybe the question is, when will we build a world where it doesn't matter who the king is because no one has that much power over other people's lives? When will we create systems that don't depend on the benevolence of the powerful, but that distribute power more equally, that protect the vulnerable, that hold everyone accountable regardless of status? Those are the questions Arthur's ghost asks us. Not, what if I had lived, but why does it still matter so much who rules? In April 1502, in a draughty castle in Wales, Arthur Tudor took his last breath. His wife Catherine sat beside him, holding his hand. She was 16 years old. She didn't know that his death would set in motion a chain of events that would kill thousands, shatter kingdoms, and reshape the world. She just knew that the boy she'd married, the boy who'd been kind to her even when he was too weak to be anything else, was dying. And in the silence that followed his final breath, in the space between one heir dying and another stepping forward, history held its breath, because in that moment, everything was still possible. Arthur could have survived, the fever could have broken, his lungs could have cleared, and if they had, the future would have been different. Not better necessarily, not worse, just different. Catherine would have been queen for decades instead of being cast aside and humiliated. Anne Boleyn would have lived quietly and died forgotten. Mary would have grown up secure instead of broken. Elizabeth would never have been born, but perhaps another extraordinary woman would have taken her place. England would have remained Catholic, the monasteries would have stood, and thousands of people wouldn't have burned at the stake for their beliefs. But other people might have burned for different reasons. Other wars might have been fought. Other injustices might have flourished in the quiet stability that Arthur brought. Because here's what we learn from Arthur's ghost. There are no perfect histories, only different paths with different costs. Henry's reign was catastrophic for many people, but it also shattered old structures, created space for new ideas, and accidentally laid the groundwork for progress that Arthur's careful diplomacy might never have achieved. Arthur's reign might have been gentler, but gentleness can preserve injustice just as effectively as violence destroys it. Sometimes the old order needs to be torn down before something new can grow. And maybe that's the most terrifying, most beautiful lesson from this alternate history. That we don't get to choose between good timelines and bad timelines. We only get to choose what we do with the timeline we're given. Arthur died, Henry ruled, the world we know was born from that chaos. And now it's our turn. We inherited this world, this complicated, scarred, imperfect world. And the question isn't, what if things had been different? The question is, what will we do now? Because the past is fixed, but the future is still unwritten. And every moment, every breath, every choice, those are the turning points where history pivots, where new timelines branch off, where we decide what kind of world we're building. Arthur's death changed everything, but your choices can too, not through violence, not through absolute power, but through the steady accumulation of small decisions to speak up, to resist injustice, to imagine better possibilities, to refuse to accept cruelty as inevitable. That's the real lesson from Arthur's ghost. History isn't about kings, it's about all of us making choices, creating ripples, shaping the future, even when we can't see the full consequences of our actions. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, as you think about Arthur and Henry and all the women who suffered and survived, remember this. You are living in someone else's alternate timeline. Someone in the past made choices that created your present, and you're making choices that will create someone else's future. Make them count. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a history that never was. If you enjoyed exploring this question, what if Henry VIII never became king? Leave a like and let me know in the comments what other historical what-ifs you'd like to explore. And remember, the past shapes us, but it doesn't define us. We are the authors of what comes next. Sleep well, dream of better worlds, and wake up ready to build them.